He's begun programming 20 years ago and has spent the last 10 years working as a lead engineer and a lead architect. So he will be presenting something very interesting. I have no clue what he's going to talk about, but it's called What Are We Trying to Agree On Anyway? So Sascha, please, round of applause for Sascha.
Nice. Okay, so what are we going to agree, trying to agree on anyway? This will be a talk on decision making. This is politics, or as it's called in most of the blockchain world nowadays, is governance. This will be mostly a rant. It will contain lots of gross oversimplifications, mostly because there's not enough time to go into everything, and I'm not a political scientist. Why is this interesting? Well, it's mostly interesting because, at least as far as I can see, there are a number of people in this group, in this room, who will most likely or most definitely shape the future of aeternity, and therefore should, as far as I'm concerned, at least have some sort of basic knowledge of how maybe decision-making and decision-making processes might change how the eternity blockchain system is going to evolve. So in general, decision-making is concerned with aggregation of information. Most of you are probably aware of this, just like a show of hands, okay, who's agrees, and just as sort of gauging the interest of a group whenever you have some sort of decision to make. It can also be used as some sort of, I guess, commitment device, meaning that if I publicly say I am for this thing that we're trying to agree on, then you sort of commit yourself to also defending it in the future. At least you should. And the third thing, which is probably the way in which most people use it in the blockchain space, is more as like a device for legitimacy, meaning that if they can somehow show that, I don't know, some sort of majority has said, yes, we want this, or no, we don't want this, then it gives us some sort of legitimacy as saying, okay, we can act upon this. And the sort of decision-making works for groups and individuals, meaning that, I mean, I myself have decision-making processes inside my head, but they're not very interesting in this context, so I'm mostly going to focus on groups. So who are we? Meaning, what sort of groups do we have? Loosely, we have probably the one that is the biggest one is the ones who have some sort of coin holding capacity, meaning that, I don't know, they own Eternity tokens on the exchange or have their own wallet, whatever. Which then the next group is miners, which are mostly responsible for block production, running full nodes, whatever. We have devs, or more or less core devs, meaning those are the people who, in the end, write all the code to make this sort of nice peer-to-peer network somehow work, and which is a very, very small group. It's a very, very exclusive group in a sense that it's sort of hard to get into it, and they're in a very privileged position as far as decision processes goes for the future of the network. Then we have this more general devs, like app developers, people who want to build something on top of the Eternity protocol. We have some sort of way to influence things, like okay, we need this, we want this, but it's still, in the end, it's at the discretion of the, I guess, core dev team to say, yes, we're going to do this, or no, we're going to do this not. And then the biggest group after the whole coin holders, it's probably just the quote-unquote normal users, which are just everyday people who just try to interact with any sort of app that is written to use the Eternity blockchain. And there's going to be overlaps of different groups, so these are not exclusive, and these are not exclusive. So the thing, if we look at analytical politics, which is sort of the science of decision making, then what it takes to be a group is sort of like we need to, before we can even like be considered a group, we need to agree on sort of how do we make decisions. And if we can't agree on how we make decisions, then we're not even a group as far as political scientists are concerned. So then the thing is, okay, to be in a group and out a group, especially in blockchain systems, is very fuzzy. Anybody can start mining, everybody can, or just about anyone can start contributing code. Anybody is more or less open to use any of the apps that are out there. So it's really hard to say, okay, who's actually in this group, how we're actually going to get people to agree on like decision-making devices, if you will. And so, for example, one thing, like I said, like for a miner to be considered to be in the mining group would most likely be downloading the eternity client, start mining, meaning trying to solve proof of work puzzles and submitting blocks to a network. But there's obviously much more to it. On a high level, there might be bonding curves and lots of other fancy things, which is like token holding, whatever. And there's also like the big topic of like how do we get out of this group? For miner, it's easy. You uninstall a node and that's it. For core dev, might be a bit harder. Just saying, okay, I quit. For someone who entered into a group via a bonding curve, it depends on, is there any liquidity? Can I actually sell my tokens? Things like that. So there's varying degrees of, okay, how easy is it to get into the group and how hard is it to get out of the group, or vice versa. And I mean, the topic of exit, like how to exit a group is more or less a talk in itself, and I'm not going to go further into it, but it's really interesting if you're interested in it anyway. But the problem is also with the bigger the group gets, the harder it is to make any sort of decision, which, I mean, seems quite obvious, but is not always respected in when you think about governance, is that the more people that are involved in trying to make a decision, the harder it gets, meaning it favors the status quo, meaning a decision, like it takes longer to get to decisions, and so it's something that needs to be kept in mind, and also means that the sort of the cost of disseminating information is much higher, and it's really complicated. So then next question is then, okay, if we for some magical reason have managed to form a group and decided, okay, we want to be a group, then okay, how are we going to agree on things, which is sort of the crux of the matter, and which means that if we take a group and a group is made out of different actors, we say, okay, everybody in this group has some sort of preference, and what we're trying to get from these preferences some sort of mapping to like some sort of choice. The most simple example that most of you are probably aware of is first past the post or plurality rule, where everybody gets basically one say. Everybody can choose one preference and say, okay, this is my preference, and all the preferences are aggregated, and the preference with the most votes wins, meaning that, okay, it's whoever has the most votes. Yeah, whoever has the most votes wins, sorry. The problem with that is that you only get binary feedback, basically meaning, okay, I can only say, yes, I like this, or no, I don't like this, or yes, I like this, or I like this. In the outcome of the choice, there's no grading, meaning, okay, there's a choice, or everybody else basically loses, which is not great. Let's just put it like this. Then there are more like fancier things as quadratic voting, and sort of, even if you will, like coin-based voting is It's more gives you more of like like an easier time to get sort of a gradient of feedback. If you look at quadratic voting, meaning that I can basically put a weight onto my vote, meaning that okay, I can just not just say yes, I like this, or no, I don't like this. I can say okay, yes, I like this, but I like this, I don't know, 100 times more than maybe the next person likes this, which is nice for sort of getting feedback of okay, how important is this thing actually, or how important is this issue. But the general problem is that if we look at like these sort of aggregation or voting systems, if you will, is that none of them are strategy proof, meaning that if you have a large enough correlation of people who are trying to game the system in some sort of way, they will always find a way, which is sort of depressing, but that's unfortunately how it is. So there's a question, okay, what is the best system? And there are lots of very, very complicated systems also with runoff voting and ranked choice and lots of sort of complicated things which make like include the increase the cognitive overhead of trying to think about your vote. But in the end, it might just be the best to think of the best system being the one that people actually understand and can trust in that sense. Meaning, because if I don't understand the system, it's much, much harder to like, put trust into it. Not faith, but trust. So if you say that there's no way to, or, well, no way to have a voting system that is not strategy proof, then that means also that being able to choose which sort of voting system you use or puts you into a very powerful position, meaning that you can change the outcome of a vote just by choosing how votes are aggregated, which is a nice position to be in. But it brings me to like basically the sort of 3 dimensions of power you need to consider is like which are described by Stephen Lukes, which is first is a very simple and direct power. It's the first dimension of power. It's like, okay, for example, I'm an elite, and I can just say, okay, this is how it is. There's no to it, which is very easy to detect, very easy to see. It's like, okay, if someone says this is how it is, and they have some sort of whatever form of power, then okay, that's just how it is. Then there's the second dimension of power, meaning this is setting the agenda. That means, okay, I can basically influence what is actually agreed upon and what is not agreed upon, which is also sort of very powerful, meaning that if I have the power to say this is not something that is even going to be agreed upon, then obviously I'm going to change how people are going to vote or make decisions. And then the third one is the most powerful, but it's also the most fuzzy, if you will, which is having the power to sort of say what is right, meaning which is usually associated with state propaganda, but in the blockchain space it will mostly be marketing, I would say, which is propaganda as well. Meaning that if you can frame sort of for people, okay, this is something that is not even like, that you should not even consider, then it obviously changes the way people are going to vote. For example, in Bitcoin, the best example would be the 21 million, there will only be 21 billion Bitcoins. This is sort of this I guess, institution of Bitcoin saying, okay, if you say you want to change 21 million of coins of Bitcoin, then you're not even going to talk about Bitcoin. We're not even going to consider it. So it's a very powerful tool, but it's also, in a sense, like the hardest to sort of influence. So then, if you have chosen any sort of aggregation mechanism, then the next thing you need to think about is, okay, what is like the costs and benefits of these sort of outcomes that we're trying to agree on, and how like what is actually the different people's stake and like actually revealing accurate information, meaning that if we take our voting app, for example, there's no real reason why people other than there's no real reason why people need to reveal the actual conviction of, okay, how do I feel about this issue, because there's no gains or losses, at least direct gains or losses attached to it. So it's sort of a very, I guess, weak signal, because polling is very, very easy and it's cheap in the sense that there's no cost attached from the other, like a transaction cost or whatever it is. So that's something to be thinking of. And yeah, there's also very important thing which we've talked about, especially when it comes to changes in the protocol and people trying to assess which change is a good change, is then just a cost of actually acquiring enough information to be able to understand, okay, what does this even mean? What does this change involve? How do I even assess whether the change is a good change or a bad change? And there's obviously there are different dimensions to this assessment as well, where you say, okay, is this a quote unquote good change because it's aligned with what I want? Is it a good change because it increases the greater good of whatever system we're trying to do? And there's just lots of very conflicting things which you need to include, need to take into account when trying to design or trying to decide how you're even trying to decide, basically. So there's the that's right. The problem of cost with attached to any sort of decision making is usually depends a lot on whether you're trying to act in a very structured system or very structureless system, meaning that a structured system would be a system of very rigid rules, everybody knows what to expect, and a structureless system would be a system of, okay, nobody really knows what the rules are, but someone can enforce them somehow, whatever that means. So yeah, the problem is that, or at least the way if we look at aeternity right now, we have not very many rules, so it's very hard for people to assess, okay, what is going to happen next, which makes the sort of the cognitive overhead of people trying to sort of expect what is going to happen very, very high, which is not a great thing, because sort of the cognitive overhead is it's basically not very good. Let's just put it this way, because the cost of this uncertainty just makes everything much more expensive. Meaning, okay, if there's change going to come tomorrow, there's going to throw everything over they've done for the past month, and obviously the sort of constant expectation of, okay, this is going to happen is going to make everything much more slower and much more taxing, both psychologically and probably also monetarily. So the next point on the institutions is sort of in accordance with the structure for the structured less, meaning that if we look at aeternity right now, we have sort of two institutions more or less, which is the Anstalt and the foundation. And the decision-making process of these two institutions is not very easy to follow from the outside anyway. Even from the inside, it's sometimes hard, but the sort of problem that we have right now is that these two institutions, meaning the Anstalt and the foundation, are basically the only two institutions that sort of employ people in this ecosystem, which is not great, because if we want to build any sort of decentralized system, whatever that means, that then having very few institutions that sort of have influence in the system will basically just mean that these institutions get stronger and stronger, because even if there are some, for whatever reasons, new institutions popping up, then sort of the network power that they've built over the past 2 to 3 years or whatever just makes it much easier for people to just come to them, because obviously they have most of the information, because most of the information flows through them. So it's obviously much better to go to them, because they're in a much better position, and yeah, they're in a much better position, period. And then probably the most important problem in the short to long term is then, okay, accountability and disputes. Meaning, if we make, whoever we is in this point, make any sort of decisions, then how can we deal with accountability and disputes? A great example, which is currently going on, is that there was nano array blocks, whatever they're called right now. They're currently having like a class action lawsuit going on because their coin was listed on an exchange, and the exchange got hacked, and lots of funds were stolen. But the developers of the blockchain system didn't do anything, meaning there was not like the DAO, there was not like sort of like a bailout by the developers. And now they have a class action lawsuit by coin holders going on because they did not bail them out. And it's exactly the sort of problem where like accountability and disputes become very important. Meaning, if there's no structured process of how like governance in the system is handled, then the first thing they're going to go for is the developers. And like this is a very hard problem, and if there's no governance or good governance in place of how to deal with these things, then it's just going to end like this, where it's like people are just going to sue them and just like drag them down into the quote-unquote real world, where legal systems still prevail, even though you're basically running a peer-to-peer system. And there's also, at the moment, there's really no credible way of holding any of the core developers accountable for whatever they're doing, which is good and bad. Yeah, which is good and bad. But yeah, I mean, I agree. But the problem is that it basically makes this more of a popularity contest than anything else, which is, can be nice, but also not. And then the dreaded on or off chain is, I'll keep it very short because I'm almost all the time, and there's also lots of things to say about it. The problem basically with on and off chain governance is that anything that cannot be observed on chain is basically not governable on chain. Meaning that if we want to have automatic code updates, then the code needs to be executed inside a VM that the chain quote unquote understands. Otherwise, there's no accountability, and you can just say, okay, we agree on this hash, but in the end, if nobody does anything, then there's nothing happening, which is sort of pointless. So the problem of on and off chain is mostly about measurability and any sort of human processes, meaning, I don't know, who writes this code is very, very hard to measure, if not impossible, on chain. So there's a whole lot of mess coming and already there. The only thing that you can really put on chain are just, or should be things that are easy to track and easy to automate, which is very fuzzy. So what are you trying to agree on anyway? I don't know. It doesn't really matter. As long as we get the processes right, there's just no point on trying to beforehand try to see what we're trying to agree on. And in general, just governance or politics or whatever can be seen as just like an exploration of like the possibilities of you have. So it's a very random process. It's a process that is very, very much path dependent, meaning that if we make a decision now, the decision will set us up for a path into the future, and it's very hard to get off this path. And I guess the big takeaway is that we should rather now than later start to make the process a bit more, well, add some more rules, make it a bit more legible from the outside to see, okay, how a decision actually made inside the team and things like that. That's it.
Right, thank you. Thanks, round of applause, guys, come on. Any questions? I think that was a very interesting presentation, very live.
Do you see any governance system in the wild which is being used on scale, where you would say it works as it's supposed to work? Where
Just in general, in blockchain systems?
in the blockchain world, yeah.
Well, I mean, the best example is probably also the most well-known example is Aragon, which they have a very decent process of like handing out funds, and they have, I mean, at least as far as like blockchain space is concerned, a very involved community, even though like the turnout for their votes is still just like, I don't know, 7%, 8%, but it's like, that's the sort of numbers that you're going to get is like 10% is already like insanely high, basically. And then there's obviously, if you want to look at more like automated things, like based on like Tezos, for example, they had like their first couple like actually on-chain updates, which sort of went smoothly for lots of reasons, because they were very simple and whatever, but they voted on them, they went through all the phases, and it sort of turned out good. So, I mean, it's looking okay, but still, yeah, very like small-scale things, basically.
There is another one called Caleris, by the way, which is very similar to Aragon, so there's just something for you to check out.
Yeah.
One more question?
Yeah, I found it very interesting that you mentioned the cognitive overhead of informing yourself of how to actually take part in governance processes. And I mean, this is like on a larger scale. If you have any governance system, then there's also, always some sort of entry barrier, which makes it easy for some people who know about these technicalities and the processes to get in there and actually vote. And then you have other people who might have to do a lot of work to actually find out what is actually discussed and then actually take part in the voting, even though those people might be the ones that have a better knowledge of what is actually voted on. And I mean, I know that Aeternity has established some voting tools, and some public votes took now place. What's the developer perspective on this direction? Do you have, I don't know, I mean, I know the discussion mostly from the higher level, from the non-technical level. Do you have anything specific to add from the technology there?
I mean, in general, I agree. Obviously, if we look at lobbying, this is exactly the thing where like we have one very big like interest group who has like basically all the capital in the world to like navigate this very fragile system. But I mean, the thing what you said, I think I mean currently there's only the app that Philip just released, which is like the first step in sort of like trying to like gather signal from like whoever wants to signal, basically. But in general, I mean, what we're like the foundation is currently working on is like trying to make the process of getting money easier, and like this is sort of the first step to governance, because like funding, like having tools available to yourself to fund like endeavors is like one of the fundamental things you need for governance, because if there's no money, then you can't do anything, more or less. But I'm not sure like what exactly you mean from like a technical standpoint. Do you mean just like getting more tools, or
making it easier for people to actually technically vote? I mean, this is also, of course, part of the whole making the UI generally easy for users to use any blockchain tools. So it's not really separated from that. But I thought, okay, maybe you have something specific.
Well, I mean, in general, of course, I think the biggest problem is, like you said, sort of the cognitive overhead. And I mean, we talked about like whenever we want to have like a big protocol update, like trying to explain it as simply as possible, which is like an obvious thing to do, but it's like a first step towards making more people sort of be able to partake in more technical decision making. But in general, I don't know, it's really hard. I don't have a good answer for you.
Okay, let's have one more question.
Hi. So I like the on-chain versus off-chain debate. Do you think there's some kind of effort to put everything on-chain, and or do you think that there will always be some off-chain decisions being made, and they can never be put on-chain?
Oh yeah, sure. As long as humans interact with the system, there will be off-chain decisions, unless our brains are somehow represented all on-chain. I mean, the people, or as long as people are like actual people are writing codes, it's like there's nothing that constrains you to just on-chain. It's just, I mean, in the end, it's just like convention basically, and sort of a shared drive towards making this thing grow and making this thing usable. But I mean, the more interesting question would be what can be put on chain, what actually makes sense to be put on chain. And I think not everything makes sense to be put on chain. Like on chain is nice as sort of like a coordination tool, meaning that you have DAOs and I don't know, lots of different like mechanisms to help people to coordinate. But in the end, as like I said, as long as people are still involved, I don't see a way of putting everything on chain.
Right. Thank you, Sascha. Come on, guys. Round of applause for Sascha. Thank you.